The halter remembered every hand that had held it, but the mare had never been touched at all. The binder twine tying them together was the only thing that still believed they were separate. Then the auctioneer's gavel hit the block, and the silence that followed was the sound of a scar that hadn't healed yet. I wasn't supposed to be there. I was 11, and my grandfather had told me to wait in the truck with the sandwiches, but I'd eaten the sandwiches by 9 in the morning and the truck smelled like old tobacco and my own restlessness, so I'd gotten out and followed the sound of the auctioneer's voice into the shed. Nobody noticed a small boy in a too big coat. That's the thing about auction barns. Everyone's looking at the animals. Nobody's looking at each other. The mare was the last lot because nobody wanted her. She'd been through 3 trainers, or so the talk went. The first one said she was stubborn. The second one said she was dangerous. The third one said something I didn't hear, but whatever it was, it ended with her being sent to the sale. The bidding started at £200 and died almost immediately. My grandfather taught me that you can tell everything about a horse by looking at its eyes, and when I looked at this mare's eyes, I didn't see anger. I saw something I recognized. It was the same look I had when my mother dropped me off at school and I stood at the gate watching her car disappear. The look of someone who has learned that most hands that reach for you are not kind. The auctioneer dropped the price to $150, then $120. Then he said something about slaughter buyers and the price dropped to £80 and still nobody raised a card. I remember the silence. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a full one. The kind that has weight. The mare stood in the ring with her head low and her ears pinned flat, and she was making herself small, the way you do when you know you're not wanted and you want to disappear before someone makes you. I don't know what made me do it. I've turned it over in my mind 1,000 times since then, and I still don't have an answer. I raised my hand. Not high. Just off my side, like I was waving at someone I wasn't sure I knew. The auctioneer looked at me, and for a moment there was a silence that was different from the other silences. Then he said something about a young bidder and someone laughed, and then a man in the back raised his card and the price went back up to $200 and I thought it was over. But the man in the back dropped out when the price hit $300, and suddenly I was the only bidder left. The auctioneer looked at me again. He had a face that had seen everything and stopped being surprised by any of it. Sold, he said. To the boy in the blue coat. I didn't have £300. I didn't have £3. I had a handful of change in my pocket and a grandfather who was going to kill me. Isn't that something? You spend your whole childhood being told you don't speak up enough, you don't raise your hand in class, you don't volunteer for anything. And then the one time you raise your hand, it's for a horse nobody wanted, and you don't have a penny to your name. The halter was still tied to the rail. It was old. The leather was cracked and faded to a color that wasn't quite brown anymore, more like the gray of a winter sky. The stitching at the crown piece had come undone and someone had mended it with fishing line. It should have been thrown away years ago. But it held. That's the thing about some objects. They keep their shape long after they've stopped being useful. They remember what they were made for. My grandfather found me sitting on a hay bale next to the mare, both of us watching the crowd thin out. He stood in front of me with his hands in his pockets and looked at the horse, then at me, then at the horse again. He had a way of not saying things that was louder than other people shouting. I'll work it off, I said. I'll do every chore. I'll clean every stall. You'll what? He said. You'll pay £300? You're 11. I know how old I am. He looked at the mare again. She flicked an ear at him but didn't lift her head. He was a man who had spent his whole life around horses and he knew what he was seeing. He saw a horse that had been pulled at and pushed at and shouted at until she had closed herself off like a fist. He saw a horse that other men had decided was worthless. And then he looked at me, and I don't know what he saw, but whatever it was, it made him take his hands out of his pockets and walk over to the halter. He picked it up, ran his thumb along the fishing line stitching, grunted. This halter's older than I am, he said. Seen more than most of us ever will. That was all he said. But he paid the £300, and he helped me lead the mare onto the trailer, and he drove us home through the late afternoon light that turned the fields the color of electric cobalt. The real mistake here is thinking this is a story about a horse. It's not. It's about what happens when something living decides you're safe. And you can't make that happen. You can't earn it. You can only be present when it arrives. That ride home was the longest I'd ever known, because the mare's trust was still curled up so deep inside her that not even silence could coax it out. The barn at my grandfather's property was a low building made of corrugated iron and old timber, set back from the road that led toward Epping Green. It had 6 stalls, but only 3 were used, and the mare went into the empty one at the end. She walked in like she'd been expecting it, like she'd been waiting for a door to close behind her that wasn't a trailer gate. I spent the first week just sitting in the stall with her, not touching, not talking, just sitting on a bale of hay with my knees tucked under my chin, breathing the same air. My grandfather brought me cups of tea and didn't say anything about how I should be in school, because it was summer, and because he understood something about patience that most people don't. The mare wouldn't eat for the first 3 days. She stood in the corner with her head to the wall, and I watched her flank move in and out, and I counted her breaths because it gave me something to do. On the 4th day, she turned her head and looked at me. Not through me. At me. Her eyes were dark and deep, and they held something I couldn't name. It wasn't trust. It was assessment. She was deciding. On the 6th day, she took a step toward me. It was a small step. 6 inches, maybe. But it was a step, and I felt it in my chest the way you feel thunder before you hear it. The halter hung on a nail by the stall door. I took it down sometimes and held it. The leather was stiff in places and soft in others, and the fishing line stitching caught on my thumbnail when I ran it along the seam. I wondered how many horses had worn it. I wondered where it had come from. I wondered if it remembered them the way I was starting to remember everything about this summer. The first time she let me touch her, it was an accident. I was leaving the stall and I brushed against her shoulder, just grazing it with my sleeve, and she didn't flinch. I stopped. Have you ever had a moment with an animal, maybe even one everyone else had given up on, where a single accidental touch told you more than any words could? She didn't move. I stood there with my hand half raised, the way I had at the auction, and something in me understood that this was the moment. The one you can't plan for. The one that either happens or doesn't. I placed my palm flat against her shoulder. Her coat was warm and rough, and I could feel the muscle underneath, tensed and ready, waiting to decide. I kept my hand there. I didn't move it. I didn't stroke. I just held it against her, palm open, fingers loose. She turned her head slowly and her breath touched my wrist. Warm. Soft. She didn't pull away. Here's the beautiful part. After that, she started following me. Not all the time. Not like a dog. But when I walked out to the field, she would leave the group of horses she'd been standing with and walk over to the fence and stand where I was standing. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't nicker or nudge. She just stood, and I stood, and we watched the same light fade across the same fields. I called her Star. Not because of any marking. Because of the night I first led her out of the barn and she looked up at the sky and I saw her eyes catch the light from a single star and I thought, that's what she is. Something that only shows up when the sky is dark enough. The rest of the summer passed in that slow, golden way that only childhood summers can. I learned her rhythms. She liked to be scratched above the scar on her eye, but only if I came from the side where she could see me. She drank water in 3 long gulps and then lifted her head and looked around before drinking again, like she needed to check that the world was still there. She hated the sound of metal against metal. She loved apples cut into quarters, not slices. You know what people said when they saw her. They said she was broken. They said she had something wrong with her. They said she'd never be rideable, never be useful, never be anything but a pasture ornament. They said it like it was the worst thing in the world. To be useful. I was 11 years old and I didn't know how to say what I wanted to say, which was, she doesn't need to be useful. She needs to be here. And so do I. The perspective shift happens without you noticing it, usually. You think you're saving something, and then one day you realize you're the one being saved. It happened in August, on a Sunday evening when the light was neon orange and the whole world looked like it was on fire but in a gentle way. I was sitting on her back. Not riding. Just sitting. She had walked under a low branch and I had swung up without thinking, and instead of bucking or running or doing any of the things the trainer said she would do, she stood still. She stood still and waited for me to tell her what came next. I didn't tell her anything. I lay forward along her neck and closed my eyes and felt her heartbeat through my cheek. It was steady. Slower than mine. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was in the wrong place. That was the week my mother came to pick me up. She stood at the fence with her arms crossed and watched me walk the mare in circles around the field. The halter rope hung loose in my hand. I didn't need it. The mare followed because she wanted to. She looks dangerous, my mother said. She's not, I said. That's what they said about the last one. The last one. That's what she called every horse I'd ever loved. The last one. As if loving something meant losing it. The mare stopped walking and turned her head to look at my mother. It was a long look. The kind of look that sees everything. And then she lowered her head and pushed her nose into my shoulder, and I wrapped my arm around her neck, and I didn't care that my mother was watching. I'm not coming home, I said. That was the exact moment I stopped being the boy who waited in the truck and became the one who would follow that scarred mare anywhere. You have to come home. Then she's coming with me. We argued for an hour. My grandfather sat on the porch and didn't say anything, but he was listening. I could tell by the way he didn't light his pipe. He only didn't light his pipe when he was paying attention. In the end, a compromise was reached. The mare would stay at my grandfather's. I would visit every weekend and every holiday. It wasn't what I wanted, but it was something. What strikes me at this point is how close we came to losing it all. How one decision, one reasonable adult decision, could have undone everything. My mother could have said no. She could have sold the mare. She could have done any number of things that would have been sensible and practical and completely wrong. But she didn't. And I've never quite understood why. The autumn that followed was the best season of my life. I took the bus from London on Friday afternoons, changing at Epping Station and walking the last mile and a half along the lane that turned from tarmac to gravel to dirt. The mare would be waiting at the gate. Not because she knew when I was coming. Because she was always at the gate. She had started standing there sometime in September, and after that, she was never anywhere else. We walked the fields together. Was the narrator right to trust this mare despite everyone else labeling her dangerous, or did they let sentiment cloud their judgment? We walked the edges of the forest. We walked until we were both tired, and then we sat in the barn and I read aloud from books I'd brought from school. She didn't care what I read. She just liked the sound of my voice. That's the thing about animals. They don't need you to say anything important. They just need you to be present. The halter hung on its nail. I didn't use it anymore, but I never took it down. It had become part of the barn, part of the story, part of the thing that held us together. Winter came early that year. The first frost hit in November, and by December the ground was hard and the horses' breath hung in the air like ghosts. I came out on Christmas Eve with a pocket full of apples and a new halter I'd bought with money I'd saved from doing odd jobs for the neighbors. It was good leather. Stiff. New. It smelled like a beginning. I walked into the stall and the mare was lying down, which she never did when I was there. She was on her side with her legs stretched out and her eyes half closed, and I knew. I knew before I got close. I knew by the way the air was too still. She was 17 years old. That's not old for a horse. But she had lived a hard life before I found her, and the cold had been too much, and her heart had simply stopped. The vet said it was quick. She said the mare didn't suffer. I didn't believe her. But I nodded, because that's what you do. I sat with her for a long time. The new halter was still in my pocket. The old one was on the nail. I took the old one down and held it in my hands, and I thought about all the things it had seen. The auction. The first touch. The walks in the dark. The night she lifted her head to a single star. I buried her myself. My grandfather helped, but I did most of the digging. It took the whole day. The ground was hard and the hole had to be deep enough that nothing would find her. We put her in the field where she used to stand and watch the light fade. I put the old halter on her before we covered her. It was the right thing to do. She had worn it when I found her. She should wear it when I left her. The new halter sits on my mantelpiece now. I'm 57 years old. I live in a flat in Walthamstow, which is a long way from the fields of Epping. But the halter is there, on the shelf above the fireplace, and sometimes I take it down and hold it. The leather has started to soften. It's learning its own shape. There are some bonds that don't need words to be understood. I knew that before I was 12. I knew it in a barn at the edge of London, with a horse nobody wanted, wearing a halter that should have been thrown away. And I know it now, sitting in a room that smells like tea and old paper, holding a piece of leather that has outlasted everything it was attached to. I still don't know why I raised my hand that day. I don't know what made me do it, but I know that it was the most important thing I ever did. And I know that she knew it too. If you've ever been the one nobody wanted, and found someone who wanted you anyway, you understand. And if you haven't, I hope you do someday. Because it changes everything. It changes the way you see the light. It changes the way you stand at a gate. The old halter is still in the ground, with her. The fishing line stitching is probably gone by now. The leather is probably returning to the earth. But I like to think that somewhere, in the dark soil of a field in Epping, a piece of it remembers the shape of her head. And that's enough. That's more than enough. I don't know what I believe about what happens after. I know what I hope. I hope she's standing at a gate somewhere, waiting. Not because she knows when I'm coming. Because she's always at the gate. That's what I think about, late at night, when the flat is quiet and the new halter catches the light from the street lamp outside. I think about the way she turned her head to look at me, that fourth day. The way she decided. And I think about how none of us know what we are deciding in the small moments, the ones that seem like nothing. The ones that change everything. The halter is older than I am now. The one on my mantelpiece. It's seen more than most of us ever will. And it's still learning its shape. Just like I am. Just like all of us. That moment when you raised your hand, would you have done it if you knew how it would change everything? If you've ever started something you didn't finish for 30 years, hit like to honor that patience. If you know what it means to wait at a gate for no reason, this is where you belong.